Thank you and good morning. And thank you for invitation to this conference. It's a pleasure, and I think that it is important that environmental experts and business experts talk to each other so that we find a reasonable and smooth way forward. I was told to discuss the implications of the Paris Climate Agreement for the petroleum industry, but in a wider context. And a wider context it has. So that I will actually probably spend more time talking about the context than about the agreement per se. But let me start with something you probably rarely hear from an environmentalist, with praising the oil industry. And in order to do that, I will make a small step aside from the climate topic. 30 or 40 years ago, oil spills were one of the most serious dimensions of oil industry's environmental footprint. Here or there, a tanker crashed, spilled lots of oil, flooded coasts with oil, killing thousands of birds and depriving people of enjoyment of beaches. It's 2016 now, and we almost solved the problem. Because of insurance costs, new regulation, fear for corporate reputation, and new technologies, we were able to cut the number of tanker accidents almost to zero. Now, isn't it just because tankers got larger over the time so that there are fewer but worse accidents? Hardly, because the number of large accidents has actually gone down as well over the time. Now, this is not to say that oil spills are not a problem anymore, or that tanker shipping accidents are the only cause of them. But and if there is anyone from BP in the room, they will know what I'm talking about. But it probably illustrates a substantial improvement in environmental and safety performance of oil industry over the previous several decades. And it's probably important to reflect on what we already achieved in order to find reasonable solutions for way forward, and to understand that when governments, businesses and environmental groups work together, we are able to achieve a cleaner and healthier environment, just as we did with our cleaner seas over the previous decades. Now, I'm saying that because we will spend much of the coming years debating our next steps and the past, even if in a slightly different issue, may serve as a useful but indirect lesson here. Now, back to the climate issue. As you surely know, the international community agreed to start with a gradual global phase-out of fossil fuels in Paris. Now, but when you look at the Paris Agreement, it actually sounds quite vague. The Article 4 says, commits the countries to, quote, achieve a balance between anthropogenic emissions by sources and removals by sinks of greenhouse gases in the second half of the century, unquote, which roughly translates as we will almost stop burning fossil fuels by the end of the century. But that's it. No figures, no specific requirements, no targets. But despite that, and actually partly because of that, the Paris Agreement is generally seen as a breakthrough. And the reason is that in Paris, the diplomats simply gave up on what they've been trying to do for more than 20 years, to forge a global climate treaty in which every single country will decide on each other's national commitments. And instead of that, they went for some kind of bottom-up approach in which every single country, USA, Europe, China, India, Brazil, Indonesia, etc., proposed with its own targets and is bound by the agreement to meet them. And the targets, while definitely not enough to achieve the proclaimed and agreed ambition in terms of climate stability, are definitely a major step forward, major and surprisingly strong first step in this direction. And this ability of the international community to achieve a bold and binding international agreement, which serves as a crucial step forward, is probably the key reason why the markets seem to take the Paris Agreement seriously. But that's agreement per se. Now, what does it mean in practical terms, especially in Europe? Coal power plants are the main source of greenhouse gas emissions and the most important source of greenhouse gas emissions, and that's why policy attention has been focused mainly on coal and electricity in recent years, and will probably continue to do so in the near future. But more than anything, doesn't necessarily mean exclusively, and equally importantly, the power sector reforms are increasingly relevant for the transport sector as well, and that probably makes them important for your industry. As you probably know, the European Union made its own commitments in terms of emissions reduction binding even before the Paris Agreement, so that there is no immediate need for new legislation right now. But after the Paris summit, some countries, including Germany, raised the question whether increasing the EU's overall 2030 emissions target will be necessary in order to meet the long-term targets or ambition of the Paris Agreement. The Commission chose against proposing this change for the moment, but we will probably hear more about that. But it also, in its last public statements, indicated that, to quote once more, the question of the level of ambition for 2030 is open, unquote, so that there may be some new debate. Nevertheless, I believe that the discussion about the overall climate target for 2030 is not the crucial debate we will be focusing on in Europe, or is not the crucial issue that will be shaping the relevant sectors in coming years. Essentially for two reasons. First, when you look at the past, extent and shape of the sector-specific legislation has been the key driver of emissions reduction in previous years, and will probably continue to be that in the future. This is a figure which may illustrate that. CO2 emissions from cars are a good example of that. This is the CO2 emissions from new cars sold in the Czech Republic since 2004, over the previous 10 years. And the obvious question is, what happened here? What happened is obviously the 2009 European Union's standards for emission performance in new cars. Now, after Volkswagen, people may have some doubts about the data, but generally it seems that CO2 data emerged much more intact from the scandal than NOx. And perhaps more importantly, while the change may look relatively slow at the first sight, it is a almost 5% emission and fuel consumption reduction per year since 2009, since the new legislation. So that if it should continue to the future, we might achieve pretty substantial emission reduction and pretty midterm future. But what I believe will be the most important shaper of change in coming years is the mutual interlinkages between regulation and technological change. We have very much focused on regulation per se in the past, and technological change alone and disappearing borders between technological change and regulation will be probably an important factor, and this is significant in several respects. And I will use probably the most visible and most spectacular, even if rather long-term, current development to illustrate this. As you probably know, electric vehicles are the ultimate, potentially the ultimate emissions reduction solution in transport. Now, electric cars are not exactly competitive yet unless you are very, very rich and prepared to pay very, very much for your new car. But at the same time, the price of lithium-ion batteries has been decreasing 14% per year since 2007 now. And this is from a research from two Swedish scientists which published last year, scientists in which they compare the past forecasts with market reality. And what they found was that even the most optimistic forecasts were something like 1 year behind the average market reality and about 5 years behind the market leaders. And it's obvious that governments will want to utilize this new avenue for emissions reduction and for new policies. Not only for emissions reduction from cars, but this new technological change also substantially expands the policy opportunities for emissions reduction in power industry, which, as I mentioned, will be probably the focus of new policies in coming years, because a mass uptake of electric vehicles would provide a new means for power storage and consequently making a mass uptake of renewable electricity much more feasible than in the past. This may be bad news for petroleum industry and the good news for the rest of us, but good news for you is that the reality is probably more complex for several reasons. First, battery price is not the only factor of consumer choice. Decisions we make when buying cars will be influenced by battery price, oil price, electricity price, and by our own habits, because in the end we've been buying oil-fueled cars for more than 100 years, and this may influence our behavior for a while. Second, even if electric cars would be available for mass consumption in, say, mid-next decade, and we can do nothing more than very wild guesses here, the average age of passenger car in this country is more than 14 years. So that in terms of a substantial change of vehicle fleet in the country, we are somewhere in late 2030s, early 2040s. And third, electric cars may be a substantial potential new instrument for reduction of emissions, provided that they actually use renewable electricity. But an electric car using, for example, current Polish power mix, Poland being one of the most coal-dependent countries in Europe, would be polluting actually more than a car fueled by gasoline. On the other hand, it's obvious that policymakers will want to walk direct and expand this new avenue in coming years. And that's probably the most crucial lesson we should expect from Paris. The Paris Agreement is not important in terms of technical legislative nitty-gritties, but as a general political statement which will direct policy making in coming years and decades. One of the important aspects of policy making will be probably disappearing borders between sectors and between policy and technological change. And last but not least, we should start thinking more long term, which means that change may not necessarily be substantial within several years, but that doesn't mean that it will not come. Things will happen even if it will take some time. Thank you.